He had driven that same road for 30 years, calm, cautious, invisible. But on this quiet morning, the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror told a different story. To the young officer stepping out of his cruiser, he was just another old black man in a nice car. No badge on the dashboard, no robe on his shoulders, just tired eyes behind the wheel of a weathered sedan. The officer's voice carried authority, the man's silence carried decades of restraint. Every second stretched thinner than the line between justice and humiliation. He could have ended it with a few words, just one sentence that would change everything. But he didn't. He wanted to see how far it would go and how deep the prejudice still ran in the land he helped interpret through law. By the time backup arrived, the world would know who he truly was. But the question is, will the system learn anything from it? Stay till the end. This story will change how you see justice. Where are you watching from? Before that morning, Judge Harold Thompson was a man most people wouldn't look twice at. 72 years old, quiet-spoken, with silver hair and a calm presence that carried both wisdom and weariness. He'd spent nearly half a century defending the law, believing in its power to protect, not to punish. From humble beginnings in the segregated South to becoming one of the most respected legal minds in the country, his journey was one of quiet triumph over injustice. He still lived in the same modest neighborhood he'd moved to decades ago, no mansion, no luxury cars, just a small home filled with books, framed photos, and memories of battles fought with words instead of weapons. Each morning, he took the same drive to his chambers, a simple routine that kept him grounded. To the world, he was Justice Thompson, a symbol of integrity. To himself, he was still the boy from Georgia who'd once been told he'd never make it past the courthouse steps. That morning, the air felt different, still and heavy, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Harold adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, smiled faintly, and pulled out of his driveway. The old sedan hummed along the road, carrying a man who had shaped laws that shaped lives. But even after all those years, there was one law he could never rewrite, the unspoken one that judged him by the color of his skin. He didn't notice the police cruiser at first, sitting across the intersection. The officer inside, young and eager, saw only what his eyes were trained to see, an elderly black man driving a car that didn't fit. One small assumption, that's all it took to set everything in motion. Harold slowed for a stop sign, unaware that his next few minutes would become a national headline. As the flashing lights appeared in his mirror, his heartbeat stayed steady. He'd seen this scene before, too many times. But this time, something inside him wanted to watch it unfold, to understand how much had really changed since the days he fought to change the system itself. This was supposed to be another ordinary drive to court. Instead, it would become a test, not of his patience, but of the justice he'd spent a lifetime believing in. The sirens wailed for only a moment before fading into the low hum of the cruiser behind him. Judge Harold Thompson eased his car to the shoulder, his hands steady on the wheel. Years of experience in the courtroom had taught him the importance of calm, especially when facing those who thrived on control. In the rearview mirror, he watched the young officer approach, one hand resting lightly on his holster, the other gripping a flashlight, even in broad daylight. The officer's steps were sharp, deliberate, full of authority he hadn't yet earned. License and registration, the man barked, eyes scanning Harold's every move. Harold nodded, slow and deliberate, moving his hand toward the glove compartment. He'd given the same advice countless times in speeches and interviews: stay calm, stay respectful, de-escalate. But in that moment, those words felt like a fragile shield against a storm that had already begun. The officer leaned closer, squinting at him. "You in a hurry, sir?" The tone carried that edge, disbelief mixed with suspicion. Harold could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest. "No, officer," he said evenly. "Just on my way to work." "To work?" the officer repeated, glancing over the car. "Doing what?" The question hung there, heavy and condescending. Harold hesitated for a moment, then simply said, "Public service." The officer smirked. "That so? Funny, doesn't look like you serve much of anything in this car." For the first time, Harold turned to look at him directly. The eyes staring back were young, too young to know what power could do when unchecked, too certain in their right to judge. Harold's silence only seemed to irritate him more. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer demanded. Harold did as he was told, feeling the gravel crunch beneath his shoes. Cars passed slowly, drivers stealing glances, recording fragments of a story they didn't yet understand. To them, he was just another black man being stopped on the side of the road, routine, unremarkable, almost expected. The officer circled the car, inspecting it like a thief searching for guilt. "Mind if I take a look inside?" "I do mind," Harold replied quietly. "There's no reason to search." That answer changed everything. The officer's jaw tightened. His hand drifted toward the radio. Seconds later, the call went out, requesting backup. Harold closed his eyes for a moment. He'd written opinions on police overreach, ruled on constitutional boundaries, spoken publicly about racial profiling. Yet here he was, living it in real time, powerless to stop it. 2 more cruisers arrived. The scene was suddenly brighter, louder, more dangerous. 3 officers now surrounded an elderly man in a suit, one who still hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resisted, hadn't moved except when told to. They questioned him again. Where was he going? Why was he here? Did he own the car? Every answer was met with another layer of disbelief. One officer even laughed softly, shaking his head. "You people always have a story." Those words cut deeper than any accusation. Not because they were new, but because they weren't. Harold felt a mix of sadness and fury rising in his chest. He thought about every case he'd presided over, every argument made in defense of justice and equality. He thought about how many times he'd believed things were getting better. But as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold against his skin, he realized the truth. Progress meant nothing when the prejudice never left the badge. The officers began searching his car, tossing papers and briefcases aside. One opened the trunk and froze. Inside, neatly packed, was a black robe embroidered with gold trim, and beside it, a small leather folder embossed with the seal of the United States Supreme Court. The young officer stared at it, confusion breaking through his arrogance. "What is this?" he muttered. Harold said nothing. He just watched, the weight of decades in his eyes, as realization began to dawn on the faces around him. But before anyone could speak, the crackle of the radio interrupted. The supervisor was on his way. And in that tense, silent moment before the truth came out, every officer on that roadside started to wonder, who exactly had they just put in handcuffs? The air grew heavier as the supervisor's car pulled up, gravel spitting under its tires. The young officer straightened, trying to mask the unease creeping across his face. Harold stood motionless beside his car, wrists still cuffed, the afternoon sun glinting off the metal like a cruel reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. The supervisor stepped out, a seasoned sergeant with weary eyes and the calm of a man who'd seen too much. But when his gaze landed on Harold, something shifted. Confusion. Then recognition. Then horror. "Wait," the sergeant said, voice dropping. "What's going on here?" The young officer spoke quickly, words tumbling over themselves. "Pulled him over for suspicious behavior, sir. Said he was headed to work. Gave some story about public service." The sergeant's jaw tightened. He turned toward Harold, squinting. "Sir, can you confirm your name?" "Judge Harold Thompson," he replied quietly. "United States Supreme Court." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the traffic seemed to fade. The officers froze, their faces draining of color as if the title itself carried the weight of thunder. The sergeant cursed under his breath, stepping forward to unlock the cuffs. "My God! Judge Thompson, I am so—" But Harold stopped him with a steady hand. "Don't apologize to me," he said softly. "Apologize to the law you just broke." It wasn't anger in his voice, it was disappointment, deep and cutting, like a teacher watching a student fail a lesson he should have learned long ago. The younger officer's lips parted, searching for words. I didn't know." Harold met his gaze. "You weren't supposed to know who I was. You were supposed to know what was right. That single sentence hit harder than any punishment could. The sergeant stepped back, his authority melting into silence. The younger cop's shoulders slumped as the enormity of his mistake settled in, the image of an elderly man he'd treated like a criminal now reshaped in his mind as the very embodiment of justice. A small crowd had gathered by then, phones out, recording every second. The irony was unbearable. The man who'd spent his life interpreting the Constitution now standing by the roadside, wrists red from handcuffs placed there by those sworn to uphold it. Harold took a slow breath, looking out at the faces watching him, the ones who whispered, "That's him, that's the judge." But he wasn't thinking about titles or headlines. He was thinking about how many others never got to speak their truth before being silenced forever. He bent down, picked up his briefcase from the ground, and said quietly, "This is not about me. It's about the justice system you claim to serve." No one spoke. The silence itself was the verdict. As he walked toward his car, the cameras followed. The officers stood frozen, their badges feeling heavier than ever. When Harold drove away, the flashing lights stayed behind, but their reflection lingered in his mirror, a reminder that even power couldn't protect him from prejudice. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered, if this could happen to a Supreme Court judge, what hope was left for everyone else? When Judge Harold Thompson arrived at the courthouse that morning, the usual whispers of respect followed him through the marble halls. But this time, they carried something different: shock, disbelief, guilt. The story had already spread. Within hours, footage from the roadside stop had gone viral. The image of a Supreme Court justice, handcuffed and humiliated, was everywhere. Inside his chambers, he sat in silence, watching the video play on his screen. He studied his own face, calm, restrained, almost detached, as the officers shouted and searched. It didn't look like anger. It looked like resignation. A look that said, "Even here, after all this time, I am still seen as less." Calls poured in, news outlets, politicians, civil rights groups. Some demanded apologies. Others called it an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Harold didn't want revenge. He didn't even want recognition. He wanted reflection. Because this moment wasn't about a single officer, it was about a system that had quietly accepted that such stops were normal. A week later, he stood at a press conference, the same calm presence before a crowd of flashing cameras. His voice, steady but heavy, carried through the room. "I do not want sympathy," he said. "I want honesty. Because if a man who helped interpret the law can be treated like a suspect, what does that say about the laws themselves? About the people enforcing them? About us?" There was no anger, just truth, laid bare. The crowd fell silent. For once, people were listening not out of curiosity, but out of shame. In the days that followed, the department announced an internal review, new training protocols, and public statements about accountability. But Harold knew change wasn't born from memos or media outrage. It began when people saw, really saw, the humanity they'd ignored. At home, he placed his worn briefcase on the table and stared at the handcuffs still faintly marking his wrists. He thought about the thousands of names, men, women, and children, who never got to tell their side of the story. Their silence echoed through him louder than any headline. For the first time in his long career, he felt something shift inside, not just as a judge, but as a man. He realized that justice wasn't something written on paper, it had to live in the hearts of those who carried it. The next morning, he returned to court, robe over his shoulders, posture firm. When he took his seat at the bench, the courtroom stood. But this time, he didn't see admiration in their eyes. He saw awakening. And as the gavel struck, echoing through the chamber, it wasn't just the sound of order, it was a reminder that no title, no power, no position could shield a person from prejudice. But every voice, every story, every act of truth-telling could chip away at it. Because in the end, this wasn't just Judge Thompson's story. It was ours. And the real question is, how many more lessons like this will it take before justice truly sees everyone the same? If this story moved you, share it, because awareness is the first step toward change. Where are you watching from? Let's talk about it below.